Give folks another minute to hop on. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our August edition of Science Cafe with the Conservation and Research Department at the Atlanta Botanical Gardens. We're really happy to have with us today Mr. Kendal Jackson, who will be presenting on Invisible Things Forgotten, a multi-proxy study of wetland plant use at an ancient Native American village on the Gulf Coast of Florida. I just want to let folks know that we will be recording this event, and you will be able to listen to a recording of this event at a later date, or if you have friends or family or anyone who was unable to attend the event tonight and would like to, we'll have that up on our website, and I will go ahead and share that link in the chat, and we also will have that link at the end of the presentation. Also, we really encourage folks to ask questions. We will have a question and answer section at the end of the talk. And if you do have any questions, just go ahead and direct those. There's a question and answer feature on Zoom here. And if you just go to the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a little box that says Q&A, and you can put any questions that you might have there. And we ask that you do it there as opposed to the chat. Other than that, I think that's the main things I wanted to let you all know before we get started. But I would like to tell you all a little bit more about Kendal. So Kendal is a PhD candidate at the Department of Anthropology at the University of South Florida in Tampa. And he's also a palynologist at the Institute for Advanced Study of Culture and the Environment. A little bit about Kendal's background. Kendal is an archaeologist specializing in the study of historical and ancient environments. He works in research and compliance settings, integrating methods from sedimentary geology and paleobiology to understand how past peoples interacted with and influenced ecological processes. He has recently published research from study sites on the Florida Gulf Coast, on Native American paleoethnobotany, and on anthropogenic drivers of 20th century marsh to mangrove wetland conversion. His ongoing dissertation research is focused on understanding the roles that ancestral Native American societies played in the establishment and transformation of nearshore estuarine ecosystems across the late Holocene. So Kendal, if you're ready, without further ado, I'll give you the floor.
Great. Thanks, Ian.
No worries. And you should be able to share your screen now.
Yeah. Go ahead and share this. Okay.
All right, looks good.
Cool. So thanks again to Ian, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. I'm excited to talk to you all about some recent research on the northern Gulf Coast of Florida. And this study is something that sort of grew out of my master's research. And it's sort of a research and science story of an unexpected research detour. But a detour into a topic that has sort of for a very long time bothered Florida archaeologists, including myself. And that research topic is the plant use, and in particular, ancient use of wetland plants, which is a paradox in Florida archaeology because, well, most of Florida is subtropical and covered in wetlands, especially tidal wetlands. Paradoxically, we have very little archaeological information about how ancient indigenous peoples utilized wetland plant resources, or really how they interacted with tidal wetlands in general. It's a difficult thing to study because in archaeology, we only get to study what's left behind, right? And the things that are left behind are typically durable. They can sit in the soil for millennia, and they're not, they're degraded only somewhat. The problem with with herbaceous plants in general, and particularly herbaceous wetland plants, is that the ones of main interest, they're not woody, they don't produce a lot of woody tissues, and they're not likely to be carbonized. So by the time we're studying them in archaeological deposits, they've decomposed into the soil and there's nothing left for us to study. So with that said, I'll kind of get started here. So most of what we know about coastal wetland plant use in Florida comes from sort of early European written records. And by, I should say, most of what science, Western science, knows about indigenous coastal wetland plant use. Of course, there are indigenous oral traditions going back to time immemorial with various detail. But as far as the sort of historical and scientific community, the earliest records we've got are from Spanish writers in the 16th century. The best known ones are from Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda, who is a Spaniard who was found shipwrecked in the early 1500s on the coast of Florida. And the story goes that he was taken captive. Really, if you read between the lines of his narrative, it actually seems like he was just taken care of and kept alive for 17 years by various Native American communities in South Florida, where he would sort of be handed off between different groups. And after spending much of his young life, 17 years in Florida, and subsequently returning to Spain, he chronicled much of his experience. And his account is sort of erratic with place names, so it's difficult to sort out the geography. But what's very clear at several points in his narrative is that he depicts fairly intensive harvesting, processing, and consumption of wetland plants, herbaceous wetland plants. He frequently refers to bread from roots or bread of roots, which, in medieval Spanish doesn't necessarily mean they're making bread. It's really just a common way of talking about starchy food. And as he says, they were harvested in many different varieties. We also find out from his same narrative that root crops, the various types of root crops that were being harvested and probably cultivated, really, in South Florida, were also involved in exchange, systems of exchange. Fontaneda describes these systems as sort of tributary in nature between societies. We don't really know that, whether tribute systems were in place, but that was his take. But certainly starchy wetland plants were being traded from inland locations to the coast and probably back and forth. So another interesting account from Fontaneda is his description of clothing in South Florida. He talks at several places about people harvesting epiphytic plants, fine epiphytic plants, and making textiles from them, which is fascinating. And of course, really none of these early Spanish accounts go into detail on the identity of the plants, but we do know they're epiphytic and that they were pretty commonly used in textile and fiber craft. In one of my favorite accounts is very brief, dealing with coastal plant use in Florida. This one comes from the Tampa Bay estuary. It's also from 1575, but it was written by Juan Lopez de Velasco, who was a cosmographer to the Spanish court at the time. And this short mention is striking because one, he describes net fishing and compares them to the way nets were used in Spain, which is sort of a really esteemed thing for a Spanish cosmographer to write regarding an indigenous population. So from this account, and it continues, of course, but from this account, we know that we can infer that the indigenous peoples on the Gulf Coast had a pretty intensive technology and process of making and maintaining nets for mass capture technology on the coast, which of course would have required a very reliable source of plant fiber that could be replenished rapidly. Because you need to mend nets almost perpetually. If anybody casts nets, that's how it works, or seine nets. So so we have these early accounts, but they're not very specific. And these are all, of course, from the 16th century. So that's where the written historic record starts, more or less. So what about ancestral peoples, pre-Columbian societies on the Gulf Coast of Florida? What were their plant use traditions like? Did they have, what were they using for fiber craft? What were they relying on as for carbohydrate resources? These are big questions that archaeologically we don't really know. And all of this is, of course, is because the plant materials very, very rarely preserve. Now, fortunately, I guess there's in the late 1800s, some very early archaeology in Florida, in Southwest Florida, at Key Marco, by an anthropologist and archaeologist named Frank Hamilton Cushing. It's a sort of a famous figure at the time in the field. He decided to excavate an inundated swamp feature. And in this wetland muck, associated with a Native American village, ancient Native American village site, he was able to recover preserved cordage that we now know dates somewhere likely around the year 1000, AD 1000. So it's very old cordage. And on the right is some of this cordage. It's a net, right? Still preserved, which is incredible. And on the left, we also have a net, but these are net floats that have preserved in the muck. Fascinating and exceptionally rare case of botanical preservation. But really nowhere else have archaeologists been so fortunate to find intact botanical remains like this. It's very rare. So we do find, however, find carbonized remains. So the best examples of this are, again, from Southwest Florida, from a program of research led by Dr. Lee Newsom, who's now at Flagler College, and Dr. Margaret Scarry. And over many years together, they've studied many archaeological sites and looked at the carbonized plant remains found in site features like storage pits or cooking fire pits, house floors, things like that. And this is a list on this slide of the species of plants that they typically find in some sort of carbonized fashion, right? So they'll find a chunk of an acorn shell or a seed from a prickly pear fruit or a cocoa plum fruit or what have you. And you have a sloppy cook or something, and these, during processing, these seeds will spill or get tossed during processing, and they'll end up carbonized in the archaeological record so that we can find them and try to reconstruct diet. So this is a list here of common plants we find that we call macrobotanical remains, right? Remains of plants that are carbonized and you can see without a microscope. But these are all more or less, they represent upland taxa where people were harvesting them for fruit or for mast, for nut resources. Another fascinating result from their longitudinal research in Southwest Florida are they've found squash gourd seeds, carbonized gourd seeds, and carbonized papaya and pepper seeds that all, upon statistical analyses of the sort of biometrics of the seeds, they're able to suggest that these plants were cultivated locally to the extent that there may have been sort of domesticate or quasi-domesticate varieties of these plants in Southwest Florida, which is fascinating because Peninsular Florida has, it's widely known among archaeologists that indigenous peoples of the region were not, sort of obligate agriculturalists. But even so, we find these cultivars, so we know that there was a sort of very intensive gardening practice, probably going back many thousands of years. But again, these are upland plants you cultivate and harvest for their fruits. And another line of evidence we have for plant use comes from stable isotope analyses on human bones from mortuary contexts. And this is a recent article from Dale Hutchinson utilizing sort of reworking data from analyses that were done a couple decades ago. It's not so common for archaeologists to work like this with human remains anymore, but nonetheless we have these data. And with stable isotope data from human bone, you can get a decent handle on diet if preservation is good. And one of their main findings from Florida Gulf Coast Native American human remains was that there's a very strong C3 plant influence, right? So we know people are eating terrestrial and wetland C3 and aquatic C3 plants, but we just can't tell what they are. So Hutchinson says that while we know folks were eating this group of plants, what they are and how they were used is sort of invisible in archaeological record. So we're in this place where we have lots of sort of hints and tidbits of ancient coastal folks utilizing these wetlands for subsistence and for technology, but only at a couple sites where preservation is really atypical and fortunate. For the rest of the coast, especially the northern Gulf Coast, we just don't know because it hasn't been looked at so intensively, and preservation is just so difficult. Now, in the sort of circum-Caribbean region, particularly in the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, and in the southern Caribbean, and throughout the neotropics in Panama, Costa Rica, there are archaeologists who are able to get at carbohydrate diet, people using starchy plants that don't produce woody materials that carbonize, right? They can't get at it from the carbonized macrobotanicals. But what they find preserved in the soil are phytoliths and starch grains. And phytoliths are sort of what that word sounds like. They're plant stones, right? They're silica, right? Like sand. So they're silica bodies produced by plants, especially grasses, really, but really quite a few plants produce phytoliths. And many plants produce phytoliths that have a diagnostic shape and form. So you can tell more or less what plant produced that phytolith. So that's great. There are also starch grains are occasionally preserved in soils and on artifacts like grinding stones or ceramic vessels. And starch grains, of course, are the remains of starchy, carbohydrate-rich plant resources. And if preservation is good, you're dealing with the right species of plant, you can identify what sort of plant residue is left behind in the archaeological record based on the starch grain morphology. So there's a lot of fascinating microbotanical archaeology going on with these two types of residues. However, and unfortunately for me and other Florida archaeologists, the soils in Florida, for the most part, and especially at midden sites like I work at, are exceptionally sandy. And they're also alkaline, right? Since there's so much marine shell and they're so frequently inundated by the water table or by tidal water, you end up with an alkaline environment with a lot of sand. The problem with that for phytoliths is that the sand, for phytoliths is that in an alkaline environment, those phytoliths will slowly dissolve, they'll deteriorate, and then other living plants will reabsorb that silica to make new phytoliths. So we've sent some samples off to specialists. I've looked for these myself, doing the proper treatments to find them. And you can find phytoliths in the soils at our archaeological sites, but they're heavily dissolved and they're not identifiable typically. Starch grains have a similar problem where, because of our sandy soils here in Florida, the starch grains are always torn into little bits. They're almost never preserved well enough for identifications. And this is, I thought maybe it was just me, I was messing it up, but turns out, at least after we sent these off to specialists, at the Paleo Research Institute in Colorado, and they had basically the same finding. I felt better about myself, and we found out this wasn't a good way to go. So in archaeology, you end up, you of course spend a lot of time excavating and you're very busy, but you also end up with a lot of time at the sifting screen, picking through shell and, finding small pieces of bone or pottery, in the screen. You have time for thinking. So it really got us thinking during our field projects, what if people were, did have a tradition of heavily utilizing wetland plants for carbohydrate resources or other plants for fibercraft, what residues would be left behind, right? What is going to be preserved? Now, most of this thinking I did while I was working on a project at the Crystal River site, which is on the Big Bend Gulf Coast of Florida. You can see there with the pink star. It's a beautiful section of Florida's coast with an exceptionally low topographic gradient. So there's just almost no topography. It's exceptionally flat. And because of that, you end up with these very extensive salt marsh habitats, which very slowly and gradually transition from freshwater wetlands to brackish to more salt marsh type environments. Sort of similar to what you'd get in the high marsh on the Atlantic coast of Georgia, but we don't get, on the Atlantic coast of Georgia, y'all get Spartina marsh, and we don't really get that here. It's Black Needle Rush marsh is our salt marsh in this part of the state. Anyway, the Crystal River site is a archaeological complex built by ancestral Native American peoples who made their living on coastal resources and constructed a village and mound center from about 2,000 years ago to about 1,000 years ago. The site became famous early on in Florida archaeology because of this guy, Clarence Bloomfield Moore, who was a wealthy physician, scientist, and I wouldn't quite, he's not often called an archaeologist because his methods left quite a bit to be desired even for his time working at the turn of the century. He was very wealthy. He would travel the Southeast in his steamship named the Gopher, which is pictured right here. And he would dig Native American archaeological sites. He was particularly interested in burial contexts, which was not unusual for the time. And he showed up at Crystal River site in 1902, I think, and he excavated for a couple of weeks and in the main burial complex, which is at the center of his map here. And like I said, his methods were very coarse. And I think in 2 weeks with his crew, of course, a crew of African-American workers, I don't think C.B. Moore did any digging. I think they dug something like 400 burials in 2 weeks, which any modern archaeologist would, that's just not possible to do in a controlled way. Nor would a modern archaeologist be interested in digging Native American burials for the reasons C.B. Moore was interested in it. But in any event, you can see his map is actually quite good. He's got a number of mounds, some of them sort of platform mounds with ceremonial stages and ramps. He's got 2 burial mounds here, one in the center and one over here. And then he got a hint of this long arcing feature that's raised above the normal ground surface. And we would call that a midden, which is a funny word, midden, which is just an enhanced soil, right? That's been created by many, many, many years of humans, a community depositing its like daily refuse, right? So the site became famous after C.B. Moore's work because in the mortuary mound he found this very ornately decorated pottery that's very unlike other deposits in the region. These are negative painted pots, which are very rare to find. So they made a big splash. Another big finding from C.B. Moore's work were non-local raw materials used to make artifacts of adornment, right? Things people would have worn, personal items. For instance, these are pure quartz crystal artifacts that have been sculpted into what we call plummets, which were likely worn as adornments. These sorts of materials, and these are silver ear spools, like an ear gauge, right? And these are copper cutouts, right, which could have been beads or fasteners or some other sort of adornment, personal adornment. None of these materials occur in Florida. And really, crystals like this, there's been some sourcing studies, and the closest place they could have come is maybe the Adirondacks. The likely copper source is near the Great Lakes. So this site became famous very early on because it showed that people many thousands of years ago on the Gulf Coast of Florida had exchange relationships that stretched the North American continent, which these days is not so surprising, but at the time it really was. So for almost 100 years, this site didn't get intensively looked at after C.B. Moore's visit, though it did fortunately get preserved by the state of Florida. So big props to the Florida Park Service. So if we fast forward to the early 2000s, I got involved with the Crystal River Early Villages Archaeological Project, which the goal was a fully modern archaeological study of this village site and mound center. So we did things like geophysical survey using ground penetrating radar, gradiometry, magnetometry surveys, which give us a peek at the subsurface without having to dig. We also took lots of sediment cores to get an idea of different activity areas at the site. And then, of course, we dug excavation units, like archaeologists do, to understand the materials people were using and when the site was occupied and how life unfolded there over its history of occupation. So here's a better look at the Crystal River site. This is a sort of a topographic map or elevation model, if you will. So here's that burial mound complex, and here are the platform mounds. This one, unfortunately, the largest mound was about 3 times this size until the early 50s, when it was bulldozed off to build a pad for a mobile home park that used to occupy a portion of the site. Not an unusual practice at that time, really. So here are our excavation units. They're all in that midden ridge I mentioned before, where it really seems like the bulk of people's daily lives would have played out, right? This was probably a place where lots of households were, places where people would have deposited refuse from daily life or from ceremonial activity as well. So what you're seeing in these pictures are the walls of the excavation units, or what we call it profiles. And you can see, first off, it's remarkable how dark these soils are. And that's just because of, a couple thousand years of depositing fish bones and plant remains and having cooking fires and other organic decomposition. You can also see just enormous volumes of oyster shell, right? Which, living on Crystal River, it's an estuarine environment. There are rather impressive oyster reefs in this area. So oyster was an exceptionally important subsistence resource for indigenous folks at Crystal River. And you can see, if you look carefully, you can see these dark or black stains extending down into the shell below. And those are very likely post-hole features, or post molds, where there was once a structure supported by posts, like structures are, and when those posts rot or the structure is burned, the mold from those posts remains in place, and you end up with a soil stain like this. So we can also get an idea of where structures were at this site. This profile on the top right looks so strange because this is the pad for the 50s mobile home park. So that one you can see they sort of truncated and graded off a part of the midden. So these are, this slide has a map with all of the core locations, the sediment core locations that were taken more or less at 20-meter intervals across the site on terrestrial locations, in wetlands, in the marsh, and in some swamp areas surrounding the site, all to get an idea of where people were doing particular activities, and to collect paleoenvironmental records. You'll notice that, of course, we avoided the mortuary areas. No sampling was done in those areas out of respect for the people that are buried there. It's something we're trying to overcome in archaeology in this region, that legacy of digging where we should not. So there's two types of core samples here. The terrestrial cores were taken with a sort of fancy hydraulic coring rig with the assistance of the late Dr. Glenn Doran at Florida State University. And the wetland cores in the marsh were taken with this small modified vibration core device. So with all of this work and something like 35 radiocarbon dates, we were able to sort of understand how this village took shape. So between 800 and 200 BC, so 3,000 to 2,000-ish years ago, all that was at Crystal River site were mortuary, were burial grounds, right? There's no evidence people were living here. This would have been sort of a vacant ceremonial place for burials. Around the turn of the millennium, that by the year AD 65, we have people building small mounds that aren't for burials and a small set of households. Then in phase two, between AD 200 and 600, we have a sort of fluorescence of site activity where lots of mounds are built. This midden ridge takes almost its full form, and it really seems like people are living here year-round. There's various evidence for that now. There's also this plaza space where no matter where we core or dig, we find nothing, right? It was kept clean. And that's very common for plaza type spaces where people gather for different events because, it's just not, deposition doesn't happen there. They're kept clean and flat. Then in the final phase of occupation at Crystal River site, the largest mound, Mound A here, was constructed. But otherwise, there's sort of ironically very little other activity at Crystal River, and occupation there starts to drop off, and people move, it really seems like, at least, people move to a new village site that's about 1 kilometer downstream. So that's sort of the site history we've been able to put together with radiocarbon. Now, I want to talk sort of in particular about two lines of research that we were able to do at Crystal River. And the first deals with the animal remains. So a trench like this, an excavation unit like this, we'll dig it in 10 centimeter levels, right? So every 10 centimeters we stop, everything from that 10 centimeters gets put through an 1/8 inch screen, which is about 3 millimeters. And that material then gets taken back to the lab and we sort it. So you dump out your materials that have come from the screen, and all of that shell and bone gets sorted by taxonomic species, right? If you can get to species. So oyster altogether, you separate the oyster from the crown conchs, from the lightning whelks, from the various other species of marine and estuarine life you find in the middens. Now, doing this, a colleague of mine, Trevor Duke, who's at the University of Florida, he was able to show, by calculating biodiversity estimates from the midden fauna, he was able to show that later as time went on at Crystal River, the diversity of animals present in the middens really drops off, and people start to sort of intensify their harvesting to just a smaller number of animals. Particularly, they start focusing on oyster and on clam. And the sort of terrestrial resources drop off. People stop, there's not so much deer, and the number and types of fishes people are exploiting really narrows. It becomes this small set of fishes that are easily taken by nets in mass capture situations. So there's sort of an intensification of a small number of resources that he argues has to do with it's sort of a community strategy for dealing with environmental perturbations that we know were going on at this time when Crystal River was waning and people were moving downstream. So that's one line of research that sort of feeds this study. Now, the other line of research that has come out of this was based on work with the soils, and particularly my work with the pollen preserved within both the cultural soils in the midden and also within the wetland soils that accumulated surrounding the archaeological site while people were living there. So from these soil cores, we have well-dated contexts. We're able to pull small amounts of sediment and process them in a wet chemistry lab to get the pollen out of the rest of the soil, the sediment. There's a number of the number of steps where you sieve, you run it through sieves, you do different chemical digestions and acids and then in a base. And then you end up at the final stage, which I have a video of, which is really great. And you separate, I say it's great because it's my favorite step. So you end up floating all of the pollen and other microfossils on top of a heavy liquid, which is this golden stuff. That's the heavy liquid. And there's alcohol on the top, which is very light in density. And the pollen is trapped in between. So you can take a pipette and suck it off, pipette off all of the pollen. And there's your sample. You end up with a nice, clean sample that doesn't have any of the mineral component, doesn't have any of the other decomposed organics. It's just got pollen and other microfossils, which is great. Then you put this mixture onto a microscope slide, and fortunately, pollen, plant pollen is very diagnostic taxonomically. So you can look under the microscope at the pollen grains that are preserved in a particular layer of sediment. And you can identify the different trees and herbaceous plants and ferns and what have you that are present, right? And you can track their relative abundance in the sediment through time, which gives you an idea of what vegetation communities are present in the area. Of course, we also get things preserved like dinoflagellate cysts, which are not pollen, of course, and other microfossils. And through this research, I was able to show that people lived at Crystal River not only for an incredibly long period of time, from a sort of Euro-American perspective, folks living at this same village, occupying the same village for 1,000 years is very impressive. Not only that, but they occupied it across very significant changes in climate and some significant changes in the estuary that are reflected in the pollen record. So one of the other, in addition to dinoflagellate cysts, one of the other really cool microfossils that get preserved in sediments are sponge spicules. So sponges, freshwater sponges like to proliferate in shallow environments, shallow aquatic environments, and they're very closely associated with emergent and submerged aquatic vegetation. So they look like this. They're small silica or carbonate structures. And these are basically the skeletons of sponges. They're really quite neat. So like I said, they naturally occur in these emergent or submerged aquatic vegetation environments. So I was really struck during my analysis, my paleoenvironment analysis of the pollen, that in the midden soils, there were just really unexpected frequencies of sponge spicules, way more than I expected. And finding a few would be common because, things move around, sediments are being transported. That's what people do. We move things around out of their natural context. But finding this many was surprising, particularly given that the Midden Ridge is not a wetland environment. It's raised at least between 2 and 3 meters above any of the adjacent wetlands. So there's no quote unquote natural reason why we should expect an inordinate amount of sponge spicules in the Midden. So I went ahead and just to satisfy my curiosity, I compared them. So I had a bunch of samples from non-cultural, if that is a thing at this site, from local wetland peats. And I compared those with the shell midden samples and found that the shell midden samples, not only in most cases, but also on average, had about twice as many, twice the density of sponge spicules. So me and the research team looking at this started coming up with hypotheses. And our main one was that sponge spicules must be accumulating in the midden soil from some sort of cultural process. In other words, there's some sort of bycatch, right? They're showing up due to some sort of activity that's going on. And right away, because I had been thinking about this, my thought went to, well, if people were harvesting wetland plants from local brackish or freshwater wetlands, that could be an explanation for why we're seeing these sponge spicules, right? People go and harvest whatever type of wetland plant they're after. They're going to do some sort of processing once they're back to a place where they do their cooking. And you're going to end up with the deposition of the mud that had been adhered to the plant, and that's going to contain a lot of spicules. Doing that frequently is going to lead to an accumulation of the spicules in the soil. So that was our hypothesis. And I sat with that for a while. And then, as I've said, you end up with a lot of time in archaeology to think about things as you're, measuring 6,000 oyster shells, and I got to thinking, if people at Crystal River were harvesting and processing herbaceous wetland plants, causing this sponge spicule signature, what other types of bycatch should we expect? And the answer is we should expect marsh-dwelling gastropods, basically marsh snails, right? And sure enough, these are marsh periwinkles. And the reason you'd expect them is because many of these gastropods, these snails, are dependent on marsh vegetation to escape from predators during high water periods of high water. They're also dependent on the plants, the bases of the plant shoots during to avoid desiccation during periods of low water or drought. So sure enough, here are some of the small marsh-associated snails that are present in the Crystal River midden deposits. All right, now these are really small, very unlikely to be targeted for subsistence. Nonetheless, they're there in droves, right? So a quick quantitative look, right? Oyster, of course, is super dominant, right? By every metric, this is number of identified specimens. This one is MNI is minimum number of individual organisms, which is the best metric for this particular application. And then biomasses, just biomass. But despite oyster being so dominant, if you look at these small marsh-associated snails, they're present in a pretty conspicuous percentage across the chronology of the archaeological site. So we have this corresponding evidence that not only are the sponge spicules accumulating, but we also have lots of these wetland plant associated snails, right? Which just sort of fed our curiosity. And then what about that pollen record that I had spent a long time looking at for paleoenvironment information? Is there evidence from the pollen itself that people were harvesting particular wetland plants? And sure enough, looking at the pollen record, of course, there are plenty of herbaceous wetland taxa, which isn't super unusual in pollen work. But it's important doing this kind of thing, if we're looking for local evidence of processing and use at a shell midden site, we really have to closely consider pollination strategy, right? Plants use lots of different strategies for pollination. For instance, this nice pine tree and most trees use wind to disperse their pollen, which we call anemophily, to be scientific Latin about it. Then if plants are dependent on insects to disperse pollen, like so many are, that's called entomophily, right? Or zoophily if it's a larger animal. And of course, we know gardeners will know about cultural pollination, squash being the easiest, most common example. So the reason we have to consider this is if I find pollen from a wind pollinated wetland plant in the midden record, it's not very surprising, right? Because that pollen is just part of the natural pollen rain that's falling out of the suspension in the atmosphere all the time, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean anything, even though there are super important ethnobotanical plants that are wind pollinated locally, like cattails or typha, different species of typha, which are documented as important ethnobotanicals in the region and elsewhere because their leaves are good for coarse fibercraft of many varieties. Almost the whole plant is edible. That said, it's not a corn dog. I don't have that gift, but you can eat the rhizomes. The pollen is even edible, and it's a well-known medicinal resource for a number of Native American societies. And there's plenty of typha pollen in the Crystal River Midden record. But because it's naturally part of the pollen rain, it doesn't mean people were using it. However, plants that are insect pollinated or pollinated by larger animals, they have a much more limited range of pollen dispersal that's very typically just in the soil surrounding that plant as insects dislodge the pollen or as the flowers fall or the plant falls over or what have you. You end up with a very localized pollen signature. So I right away limited my consideration to insect or animal pollinated taxa that are conspicuously present in the midden record. Now, these are wetland plants, right? And I've said how the midden ridge is an upland landform where we wouldn't expect this sort of deposition of this pollen naturally, right? So it has to be some sort of cultural signature. And 4 plants really jumped out as being abundant in the record and being very likely ethnobotanical resources. So we'll get to the plants. The first one and the most abundant, or that's not true, the most abundant starch resource in the midden record is Wapato, or a different species of Sagittaria. Which you can't tell the species apart from their pollen grains, or at least I can't. But we have a few different species of this genus in the region, and they all represent exceptionally valuable tuber crop resources. So Sagittaria produce these wonderful little tubers. They taste like potato. In the Pacific Northwest, Wapato is intensively cultivated and has been for many millennia, and it's sort of a very well-known indigenous tuber crop. In Florida, we don't think of it this way, but this new pollen evidence and new multi-proxy evidence suggests that perhaps we should start thinking about Wapato as an important carbohydrate resource for ancestral indigenous peoples, and arguably for a potential one for our future society. Wapato are also well-documented medicinal resources. They've been used by the Seminole Miccosukee as topical and in internal medicines, and of course in ceremonial medicines as well. Another plant in this list is pickerelweed or Pontidaria, which also there's less ethnobotanical information on Pontidaria, but there are indigenous groups in the northwestern US that have traditions of processing the corms, modified shoot tissues that are starchy, to eat as a starch, as a carbohydrate resource. And they're also used by Southeastern Native American peoples for various medicines. My favorite, just because it's one of my favorite wetland plants here in this region, is lizard's tail, or Cerurus. It has this tiny, it looks big in this slide, but this is a very tiny pollen grain. This is only 1 micron scale here. These are, don't eat this plant. They're a well-documented medicinal resource. They have well-documented sedative, antiviral, anti-tumor compounds. It's been used by the Seminole and Miccosukee as a topical medicine in baths and washes, also in internal medicines as a sedative and a sleep medicine. It's also very common in ceremonial medicines as an emetic. Lots of emetic ceremonial medicines in Florida. And a final one I want to talk about, I spent all this time talking about nets earlier, so I want to talk about bog hemp, or the false nettle. Is another good common name. It's actually a bat. False nettle is an odd common name because this is in the Urticaceae. It's in the nettle family, but Bomarea cylindrica. This is one of the most abundant pollen types in the Midden record. And I found that really striking because nettle family plants are intensively cultivated in the Pacific Northwest as fiber crops, right, for producing nets and baskets and textiles, and fishing line. And other genera of this family are used elsewhere in the world to produce textiles on an industrial scale. Rami is a good example of a textile produced from a nettle family plant. So with that conspicuous abundance of nettle in the pollen record, it really got me thinking about net making. And traditionally, archaeologists have always talked about how all this fibercraft was probably done with palm, right? But and some of these nets from Key Marco we know are made from palm. But I really think, given the new evidence from Crystal River, we need to start looking at other plants, in particular nettles, because unlike a palm tree, you could regrow a stand of Bomarea several times a year to reproduce that fiber crop. And it's just altogether a different resource. And the last thing I want to say, I don't want to take too much more time, is that on the Gulf Coast of Florida, archaeologists right now are talking a lot about intensification and how early villages set up, right? People start aggregating into these highly organized village arrangements. And that requires intensification of resources. And this discussion, till very recently, has been limited to intensification of animals, right? Oysters and mullet and clams and other animal resources. But I feel, especially with this new evidence, that we really should start looking at the role of plants, in particular wetland plants, given our setting, in sort of the rise of complex village life, right? So that's my new, and we know, for instance, we know that around this same time at Key Marco, where we have this remarkable preservation, we have artifacts like this found, very clear gumbo limbo wood pestle and a cypress wood mortar, right? So we know people had the technology to process carbohydrate resources like this, and probably had it for a very long period of time. So this study is sort of a push for imagination and encouragement to look for what's not there. In this case, it's there, it's just microscopic. Anyway, I want to say thank you to for the Florida State Park Service for letting us work at the Crystal River site. And these are some folks that have funded some of this research, and some of my collaborators who have helped extraordinarily with the field work and laboratory work. And I have here at the bottom of this slide some of my contact info, my email, of course, and then if this piqued your interest at all in coastal archaeology in Florida, you can follow my current research project Instagram account, which we try to keep active with what we're up to in the field and in the lab, and also, you know, new publications and that kind of thing. And of course, thanks to y'all for listening.
Thanks a lot, Kendall. That was a great little presentation. Do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank
Okay,
you.
good. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, it was really cool to hear about your whole process there, and just kind of I mean, it's an incredibly complex research project you've been working on, and I have lots of questions, but I'm sure some other folks would like to ask some questions as well. So if folks do have questions, feel free to put those in that Q&A section. And I see that we already have one now from Rachel Lichtenwalter, who asked, any idea what it would have been like at a midden site back then, as it relates to the oyster shells, that is?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something we think about, all archaeologists think about all the time. is what these environments were like in the past. And as someone who does paleo environment work, that's sort of specifically is my job on these projects. And we know, for instance, one of the very basic things we know is that when this site was during the fluorescence of this site, during the AD 200 to 500, sea level would have been considerably lower, right? A meter plus lower than it is right now. So that right away, especially on a low gradient coast like the Gulf Coast of Florida, you know, a meter of sea level pushes the shoreline out kilometers. Mm-hmm. So we know, for instance, that right now Crystal River is at this like very salty, brackish zone. When the site was occupied, it probably would have been a much more freshwater dominated environment. Oysters, we know there's a general trend towards oyster degradation, oyster reef degradation over time at Crystal River, which we were able to work with a sort of paleobiologist who studies oyster to track changes in oyster population dynamics through time. But you can imagine, right, like today you go to a shell midden site and they're typically heavily vegetated with trees and underbrush. But you can normally imagine a shell midden site when it's occupied as probably pretty open, not that many trees, maybe palms, or like particular important trees like cedars. But otherwise open, and probably constant fire smoke, both to keep cooking fires alive and to keep biting insects down. And there's a whole number of ways you can think about it. I always tend to think about the shells as being on the surface, oyster shell deposits being on the surface. One thing I still can't, people always want to know like what it was like walking on shell all the time for ancient folks. And I don't know, it's not so bad. We do it too.
All right, we've got another question from Megan Luckett, who asked, in regards to the 4 species that you highlighted, are these plants wide ranging across the South or just in Florida?
That's a good question. So I'll start with Sagittaria species are wide ranging across a lot of the continent, really. I mean, these occur in the Pacific Northwest, they occur in the Northeast, they're in the Great Lakes, they're in the Deep South, they're through South Florida. They're an Everglades plant. So they're exceptionally wide ranging. And that probably is not entirely, we probably shouldn't separate that from their long history of use and cultivation by Native American populations, right? Probably since the Pleistocene, right? Pontidaria, honestly, I don't really know. I see it all over Florida, but I'm assuming it extends into the greater Southeast, but I don't. That would be a good question for y'all. There are Cerurus species that are, this genus is like across the North America for sure. This particular species, I don't know. That's a good question. And same thing with Bomeria. I don't know about this species per se, but there are like species that are very wide ranging.
Yeah, I'm quite familiar with that plant. It grows, I know, as far north as North Carolina, where I used to live, and even in the mountains of North Carolina. So yeah, but several, species, of course, in the nettle family that have been used historically as foods and still today.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so we have a question from an anonymous attendee. Is there any line of research or thought on ancient impact on presence or density of wild plants and how that might impact current conservation status of plants?
That's a great question. Ancient impact on presence or density, as in, like, I guess, impact. Yeah, there are lines of research on that. In Florida, research like that is sort of burgeoning. There's a better line of research to that end for the greater Southeast from pollen work, particularly by Paul and Hazel Delcourt, who are palynologists at Tennessee, who spent many years looking for indigenous influence on mass resources, right? And their thinking was that peoples across the Holocene would have been modifying forest structure with fire in order to produce landscapes that were ideal for them for a number of uses, for hunting, for producing mast crops, and for producing herbaceous, pioneer species where they could get rapid, Yeah, that's a good. In Florida, it's tricky to study, and I honestly think that the future of answering this question is going to be fire dynamics in Florida. which is difficult to study, but it can be done, particularly with high resolution pollen records where we count charcoal and we have good radiocarbon chronologies. You can track sort of, it would be interesting to test the hypothesis that ancient folks were actively managing ecosystems with fire, which would not be a stretch. That's very, very likely, but difficult to track with paleo environment work, but it can be done.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that, because I was just wondering about that the other day, if there was any way to kind of get an idea the extent to which indigenous peoples, pre-Columbian indigenous peoples, would have used fire for management purposes. And,
yeah, I mean,
because obviously we've had fire here in the Southeast for a long time, but kind of what percentage of those fires were started by humans for management purpose?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then, it's, and I think the answer, honestly, from my read of the paleo environment literature and pollen records especially in Florida, but elsewhere too, is that fire was sort of like exponentially more common. So it had to have been a major tool for landscape management.
All right, we have another question from an anonymous attendee who asks, is there evidence that any of the discussed species were cultivated or their growth encouraged in particular areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't have any evidence from Crystal River site for cultivation, right? But that's possible to find. For instance, the best examples are in the Pacific Northwest, where they're sort of a light year ahead of us of southeastern archaeologists with human plant dynamics research, and not in part of that is because they have they work very closely with living indigenous peoples who have been able to maintain a lot of those same traditions. But so in the Pacific Northwest, Sagittaria, there's lots of evidence Sagittaria was cultivated, and those archaeologists and those indigenous folks would probably use a stronger word. They would probably say that it was farmed. Mm-hmm. So yes, but in this part of the world, no, there's no evidence yet. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Yeah.
All right. Well, we're starting to get towards kind of the 7:30 mark, which is when I kind of try to stop. But if anybody has any more questions, feel free to type them up. One question I had for you, Kendal, was the Crystal River site. You said that it was up to about 1000 AD or so that people were living there.
Yes.
What do you think? Do you have any theories as to why people would have left that site? Or
yeah, that's a big question we have, and I don't. So the sort of waning occupation of Crystal River correlates with a climatic phase in the southeast and really the whole Atlantic basin that people call the Vandal minimum, where it's basically traditionally it's understood as this cold and arid phase, sort of like the Little Ice Age, but earlier. And but the pollen evidence from Florida and some of the other paleoclimate evidence that I've been working with isn't that clear cut. It basically suggests that this time period, right around 6 to 800 AD, is just really variable in terms of climate. There are lots of droughts, lots of storms probably, and then like odd punctuated periods of high precipitation. So I think that some of what's going on with the sort of, I don't want to call it an abandonment because that's not quite right, but the sort of depopulation of Crystal River site after AD, around AD 700, 800, it may very well have to do with a shift in estuarine conditions that made downstream habitation more desirable or made it easier to supply a larger number of people with resources or what have you. But that's still a big open question. And this is a pattern that's very common at Gulf Coast archaeological sites, this sort of time period of depopulation. And it's a big open question that a lot of us are working on.
So we had a person that said that they left a question in the chat, but I'm not seeing one. So I'm hoping they can get it in the Q&A.
Oh yeah, I don't see the chat.
Yeah, the chat seems to be totally empty right now. Let's see. Well, I apologize, Belinda, for not getting your question answered there, but I'm not seeing it anywhere at the moment. But again, Kendal, thanks so much for coming out and you know, hopping on this Zoom webinar Science Cafe with us tonight. Really appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is such a great event you guys do, and it's been great to meet you and to get the opportunity to talk to all these folks. This is great.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and let folks see what we've got going on here coming up. So we're going to keep with our paleo theme. And our next webinar is going to be Thursday, September 16th at 6 p.m. with Dr. Elizabeth Harmson, who is a research scientist with the Paleontological Research Institution in Ithaca, New York. And she's going to be presenting on the diversity of the Neogene gray fossil site. That's a fossil site in eastern Tennessee on the paleo flora there, and its importance to understanding the modern flora of eastern North America. So that should be interesting. And I'm really looking forward to that talk as well. Also, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming out tonight. If you want to find a recording of this webinar, I should have it up on the website within sometime early next week. And there is the link there to that. And then also, if folks have any questions or suggestions, feel free to reach out to me at isabo@atlantabg.org. And as always, I'd love for y'all to check out our website and what kind of we're up to over here at the Conservation and Research Department. And that's at atlantabg.org/conservation-research. And for folks that are on Instagram, feel free to follow us at AtlantaBG Conservation. And again, thanks everyone for coming out tonight.
Thanks, y'all.
And I will stop recording. If I can find the stop recording